Hi, this is Mark Arnold with a new Fun Ideas podcast. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Steve Leialoha. How are you, sir?
I'm good.
All right. And we interviewed your partner, longtime partner, Trina Robbins, a few episodes ago. Usually I ask about your career, but I've never asked either of you about your relationship. I mean, how did you two meet and how long have you been together?
Well, living in San Francisco, I think a mutual love of kitties, but it being in the same town, in the same line of work, you might say, we're both doing comics and just hit it off. We have a lot in common. Here, let me.
That's okay. I may have a special guest dog too. Cats and dogs.
So we've been together for quite a while at this point.
Yeah.
Let's see. Since about 40 some odd years, something like that.
Did you actually meet in San Francisco, or is it like at a convention or somewhere else?
Yes.
Oh wow, okay.
Yes. Well,
how did that happen? You just bumped into each other one day. Hey, I know you. You know?
Well, we'd actually done a lot of conventions together.
Oh, okay. So you had met. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
But I was born and raised in San Francisco, so I've always been here.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Trina was another one of those transplants from New York,
of course.
Of which there were many, including my own mother, who had come here by way of New York and Hawaii and various other exotic places.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, and still here. Here. So.
Now, with a name like yours, one would assume, but I knew you were from San Francisco, one would assume you're from Hawaii. So do you have Hawaiian heritage?
Yes. My father was Hawaiian.
Okay.
1 second.
Okay, that's fine. It's a very laid back podcast, so things happen. They happen.
Very good at destroying things.
Yeah, that's what cats and dogs do.
Whenever you have something important, he's going to sit on it.
Yeah.
Anyway, okay. Where was it? Oh yes, my father was Hawaiian from Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
I have many relatives there, but I was born and raised in San Francisco.
Mm-hmm.
Like I mentioned. My dad was in the Merchant Marines way back when, veteran of World War II, eventually settling in San Francisco. And so I...
Have you lived in San Francisco?
Pretty much the story.
Have you lived in San Francisco your entire life, or did you ever move around?
As a kid, we moved to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. And then actually, once I got a real job, which was working for Marvel, I could afford to actually find my own place, and I moved back to San Francisco.
Okay. So, did you ever live in New York when you were working at Marvel, or is it always freelance?
No.
Okay.
It's one of the advantages of freelancing. By the time I came along, they were okay with working with people who did not actually live in New York City, or people who couldn't personally drop stuff off into the office, which is fortunate for me. I mean, part of that is I met people who were already in the business who had moved out here, which is Jim Starlin and Alan Weiss and Tom Orzechowski and Mike Friedrich, although he was interesting in that he technically came from New York, but he was actually from here originally as well. So he just moved back to the Bay Area. So anyway, I met all of those people. Frank Brunner. I knew I was forgetting somebody.
Yeah.
They had all moved to the Bay Area, and anyway, it was a lively comic scene back in the mid-'70s here. So.
And that's like where you did your first professional work, right? Is when you were doing things like Star Reach and Quack and stuff like that. How did that come about? How did you
Well,
just knowing all these people?
sure. Well, Star Reach was Mike Friedrich's publishing. By the time Star Reach had come along, I had started working at Marvel, working on as an inker on Warlock and Howard the Duck, which was, of course, Jim Starlin and Frank Brunner.
Right.
And Steve Gerber, but he didn't live here. So Mike was open to work. Well, just having worked on Howard the Duck, it certainly went along well with a comic called Quack.
Mm-hmm.
It was a natural fit. So.
Mm-hmm. Was Quack, I've seen it before, but honestly, I have never really read it. I've only seen the covers. It was that kind of a reaction, kind of like later when Gerber did his Destroyer Duck reaction, or was it?
Well, it was kind of I mean, Howard the Duck became such a curious, not quite hit, but a lot of people liked it. It was just so weird. I liked it because it was so weird. I love Steve Gerber's writing. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't say jumping on the bandwagon, but alternative type funny animal stuff, mm-hmm. not your usual Disney stuff. Yeah. And that was kind of the impetus for that. I mean, it wasn't the only one. I mean, there was a lot of people suddenly coming up with wacky, funny animal stuff.
True.
I think of like the stuff we're doing for Marvel was definitely more serious, less opportunities to play around with the material than if you're just doing a one-off for a smaller company.
Right. But wasn't Quack a little more mature? I won't say underground, but I mean a little more.
Oh, mature might be stretching it a bit, but yes.
But I mean, mature in like PG or PG-13. I don't know if it was really R or X. Okay, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Implied sexual encounters between funny animals or something like that. I don't know.
I mean, back then, Comics Code was still in force. I mean, it wasn't as strict and strong as it once was, but still,
Yeah, things were, well, I remember Jim Starlin. Actually, it was Tom Orzechowski who put in the Cosmic Code Authority on one issue of Warlock. And nobody at the office noticed it until it was printed. So
I remember that.
I was very pleased to be part of that book.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, that's where I first saw your name, was all those different books like that, all the ones you're mentioning. It was Howard the Duck and a Warlock and things like that. I was just picking them up, and so I recognized your name, and then years later we met, and I go, oh, you're the guy.
I'm the guy.
Yeah. Yes. Now, typically on all these books, you just did inking. You never did penciling or anything like that. Is that correct?
Yes, and that point in time, my drawing wasn't all that much. I was much better with a pen and a brush than I was at the drawing. So it was actually a very good place to learn. And as an inker, I was very fortunate to work over some of the best pencilers in the business. I mean, mm-hmm. It's fun, inking Starlin on Warlock and then Frank Brunner on Howard the Duck, and then Frank left after 2 issues, and suddenly I found myself inking John Buscema and then Gene Colan. So I always thought of it as like being tossed into the deep end of the pool when it comes to inking. Mm-hmm. But I loved inking Gene Colan. I liked inking John Buscema too, but he was a formidable challenge. But
how so?
He's just an incredible draftsman. I mean, really solid stuff. But what you would get was often just layouts. So it was up to the inker to add rendering, shadows, and all of that sort of thing. Well, it kept you on your toes. But I studied a lot of other inkers to see how they handled his pencils. Anyway, it was a terrific learning experience. And eventually my drawing improved enough so that Marvel was willing to give me a chance. I did a couple of tryout things. And then I remember the first thing I drew at Marvel was Spider-Woman. So I was on that for, I don't know, I forget how many issues.
Yeah.
And
I read that too back then. Yeah. Yeah. So
I think from about issue 27, something like
sounds
that.
about right. Something like that. I didn't look it up, but it's something like that. About it wasn't issue 1. I know that.
About issue 40 something.
Well, I think there's 47 issues in the first run, the initial.
Well,
run.
the book went to 50 issues, and then
it was 50 issues. Okay.
Yes,
Yeah.
they ended.
I just remember I was buying it, but I didn't always keep track of the numbers.
Yeah. Yes, at this point in time, it is a bit of a challenge to remember what issue was where.
Right. And of course, now there's been 3 or 4 volume 1. I mean, number 1s. You have volume 2, number 1.
Yes.
And it's like I give up on numbering.
They start over every once in a while.
Right.
With a whole new version.
Mm-hmm.
I actually haven't been following Spider-Woman too closely, but I always wanted to do a version where she was more spider than human, more spider than woman, but still looking good, of course.
I think they've gone that direction, but it was the Spider Girl character that's more recent. I think she has like 8 arms or something like that. I don't read Marvels much anymore, Marvels or DC. So in the current stuff, it's just like I go to the shop occasionally and I go, okay, but it's like it's not really the stuff I read anymore. So, for me, it's like your era is the era that I love the best, 70s and 80s and stuff like that, with Marvel and DC.
Well, I did like it when they gave Spider-Man 8 appendages. I mean, it seemed appropriate.
Right.
So I guess it would be hard to keep your secret identity if you've got 6 arms.
Right. And I know they're incorporating a lot of that stuff into like the current movies and stuff like that. So even if you don't, folks,
they're throwing all of them. Exactly.
Yeah. So doing that, at least I can kind of keep up that way.
It does help.
Yeah.
I did like the Spider-Verse movie.
Mm-hmm. Now going back on inking, some of these people, like you said, Bruner and stuff like that, they were local, you said, all in San Francisco at that time. So did you work together in the same studio or just go from each other's homes, or how did you do it back then?
Yes, in these pre-internet days, it was all done. One of the things that Jim Starlin and Frank Brunner had in mind was being able to produce a finished book out west and then sending it into Marvel. So the fact that I was local worked into it. So I lived in San Francisco, that both of them lived in Oakland at the time.
Oh, okay.
So it was easy for me to get there and just pick up pages. And it was also, it's very helpful to be able to talk to the penciler and go over the pages just to make sure everyone's on the same page, literally doing this stuff. So I inked a fair number of Frank Brunner's things over the years, which was nice. I inked a Savage Sword of Conan. I think that was the title. Conan had a lot of different titles, but it's hard to keep track.
Well, that one was the magazine one. Was that the one?
Yes, exactly.
Magazine? Okay.
The black and white stuff. And then I inked a story for Quack. Speaking of the Duccaneer, as well as doing my own stuff for that, but also inking Frank's stuff, and so on. But yes, it was local. I could pick up pages, and when I was finished, I can give them back to either Starlin or Frank.
Now, the ones that were on the East Coast, did you just work through the mails and just do it like that?
Yes.
So you just had to mail stuff back and forth all the time.
Yes. Working with Marvel, it was all the regular post office, and eventually Federal Express became a thing, and it switched over to that. But I've been very lucky and never lost a single package over the years. So
very cool. Yeah. I know one story
yes,
with like Sergio Aragones with Mad. I think over all the years he worked for Mad, one issue the mail got lost, and so the marginals didn't make it in that issue. And it's like,
yes. There are the occasional stories. I remember once at a San Diego convention, Ramona Fraden had, I think, a whole 2 weeks of dailies, something like that, had gone missing. And like a dozen people pitched in to help her finish off a new set of strips for to make her deadline. But yes, this stuff does happen. But it fortunately hasn't happened to me. In fact, it's still working that way. Getting Federal Express packages from the UK. So far, so good. Haven't lost anything.
Now, do you still primarily do inking today, and do you do it still the same way, pen and brush, or have you graduated to the digital world? Some people have.
We do. I do mix it up. I pencil stuff and ink stuff. I do like to do both. But so far, we're still doing it the old-fashioned way, on paper with pen and brush and ink. Although a lot of Photoshop isn't involved these days, because everything gets scanned and it's all sent in digitally. Lots of touch-up in Photoshop, fixing anything that goes horribly wrong.
Now, do you do that, or do they do that wherever you send it?
I usually do that.
Okay.
I mean, theoretically they could do it, but
right,
it's easier just to have a nice finished piece of artwork to send in,
right,
as good as I can make it.
Now, in all your years, I don't know how the professionals do it, but I mean, as far as inking goes, when you worked, you mentioned like Basima, and you mentioned Colin and stuff like that. Did anybody that you work with give you direction on how to do your inking, or were you at free will to do whatever you wanted, or how did that work?
Well, amazingly enough, no one ever did. I did ink a Rich Buckler Howard the Duck cover, and he was there keeping an eye on it to make sure, as he put it, I didn't mess it up. For he seemed to like the way it came out. So, but generally you're kind of on your own, which is can be a little tricky, because if they don't like what you're doing, they may not tell you. they'll just find somebody else to work on it. But so far it went pretty well. I had a particularly nice time inking Sal Buscema's stuff on I forgot the title. All these weird titles. Marvel 2-in-1, Marvel Team Up,
yeah.
Spider-Man and various other characters. But Sal, for example, I always thought was a very underrated penciler, but he's an extremely solid penciler. And in those days, he was doing mostly layouts, so it was really up to the inker to make it look more than just more than just layouts. A lot of the inkers didn't bother to do a whole lot, but anyway, I enjoyed working with over Sal Buscema's pencils, for example. But they left that entirely up to me how it would go.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember who exactly the editor was on that book. It all blurs together. Well, I've gotten to work with a lot of really terrific editors, and I think I've been pretty lucky on that point. So,
and I'll ask about a few of those. Before I go into that, I was just curious, kind of what your educational background was to become an inker, or just in art in general.
well, I always envied the people who could take the Joe Kubert School classes, because there was nothing like that when I was a kid. When I was a young fan, when I was in college, I was a math and science major, and then somewhere along the way, I kind of veered off into being an art major. So that was probably the extent of my art training. Lots of life drawing classes and illustration classes and stuff like that. But mostly it was working it out on the job, as it were. So, but there's nothing like inking a couple of 100 pages to sharpen up your inking skills.
So when you were taking art classes, were you taking the which university did you go to?
Oh, I went to a local junior college that just happened to have, well, in the San Francisco area, there's quite a few excellent colleges. And I checked out the art departments of all of them and ended up at the College of San Mateo, which worked really well for me because it was both free and they had a really good art teacher there who was teaching life drawing, and he was a graduate of the Pennsylvania Academy of Art, which has, a pretty impressive history of some of the best illustrators in the country. Anyway, he was a really good art teacher, which helped me considerably. And some of the other teachers there were also former Disney artists. So they had a very good coloring class. I mean, color theory, all of that sort of thing. And the life drawing class was excellent. But at that point in time, I had no idea I was going to end up. I mean, I had no designs on being a comic artist per se, because at the time the idea was you had to live in New York to be in the comics biz, or I figured, well, I had no idea where I was going to end up. Maybe Disney. I mean, also in San Francisco in the Bay Area, there's a lot of filmmaking going on, which was also really interesting. I mean, in the early 70s, a friend of mine worked at the American Zoetrope, which was Francis Coppola's company. So I got to watch new guy, George Lucas, filming THX 1138. So by the time Star Wars came along, I was very familiar with who he was and what he was doing. So, in fact, I had friends who had been extras in all of his movies along the way. So, I had two friends who were extras, and one of them played a hippie, and the other one played a cop, and they got to beat each other up. It was very funny.
Was that in THX 1138 or
no? That was in More American Graffiti.
Oh, okay.
Many years later.
Yeah.
but still. That's and American Graffiti was filmed around here too. So, well, they all were. Yeah.
I briefly worked for Coppola's company in the 90s. My wife actually worked there longer, and it was I think it just called Zoetrope. They took off the American part. And I worked there for a summer just being the receptionist because I was between jobs, and I got to go to his ranch up in Rutherford a couple times, and Lucas was there. But this is long after they've had their great success. It wasn't
sure.
So
when they were relaxing.
Yeah, basically. Although I did just get to see George Lucas chase one of his kids, so it's kind of funny. You get to see the real George. Come back here, But
Yes, I
they're
remember.
very gracious, and
Yeah,
so.
when I was there, I remember Francis. His kids were very young. I mean, we're talking, I don't know, 1972, something like that. Whatever year that was, it was a long time ago.
Mhm. Well,
But it was very interesting.
it's around the time of The Godfather. That was like
Yes,
the big film
they
for 72. So yeah.
they were working up The Godfather, and I remember Mario Puzo was there.
Hmm.
Um, John Cordy, the director, was there. I mean, it's a working production facility, so it wasn't just Francis Coppola. There were a lot
Right.
of people working on all kinds of interesting things.
Hmm.
Um, a friend of mine who got into special effects had a job there, which is how I ended up dropping in from time to time to get a look at what was going on. Anyway, so
Did
it's
you ever
getting
work?
sidetracked.
Did you ever work for them at all, or work for them, or do any storyboarding or anything like that, or no?
Not directly, no.
Okay.
Uh, Eventually, years later, I ended up doing storyboards and things like that for some of the local animation companies. But I don't think no, I never worked for Coppola directly.
Hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
Just kind of curious, because when you look at your bios, or at least ones I see, like the Wikipedia page, it's pretty much comic book, comic book, comic book. So, but I know it's not complete, so that's why I figure I'll ask you. I mean,
I
but
don't
in
think I've
general,
ever,
go
I
ahead.
haven't, I don't usually mention that because it's just, I mean, do people, I mean, in terms of film work, I've done storyboards for animation. I worked on a TV show, an ABC TV show, which was canceled after 2 episodes, I think. One of the quickest uh, canceled shows ever.
Mhm.
But on a plus note, I got to meet Adam West, who had been scheduled for a future episode that never got filmed. Um, but it's all fun learning experience. So I did storyboards for the TV show and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I know uh, trying to think. Um, I think I did some stuff for the Spawn cartoon show,
Hmm.
um, and some titles for various movies, just odds and ends.
Mhm.
Um, Interesting little side projects in between comics. So
Mhm. So, I was just kind of curious. Now it's probably easier, I suppose, for you to get a job because you have a, you know, varied resume from the past. But back then, like,
I've
did you
been
to
lucky
get the
enough to, yes.
job at Marvel in the first place? I mean, did you actually fly to New York to do it, or how did that work at that time?
No, I kind of lucked out there too. I think of it as coming in through the side door. Um, uh, Jim Starlin was looking for an inker, and I did some tryout stuff uh, for Alan Weiss, who was also part of the group out here. I did a very little amount of work helping out Alan on a Tarzan story that he was doing for a European publisher. Really nice job. I don't think I ever saw it printed, but anyway, Starlin saw the stuff I was doing for Alan and asked me if I'd be interested in inking Warlock, which it just happened that was my favorite Marvel book at the time. So I was certainly up for that.
Mhm.
So he kind of just informed Marvel that he had an inker, which I don't know how well it went over at Marvel, but at the time, the editor in chief was Marv Wolfman,
Mhm.
and I had done some fanzine work for Marv like like 8 years earlier, when I was still in high school. I mean, and I think Marv thought that I probably had improved since those days, and was willing to give it a chance. So anyway, they liked what they saw, and it all worked out. So
Well, it always seemed
that's
like
how. And
Marv
then
was open.
eventually, I did go to New York because it's always a good idea to meet the people you're working with. And so I visited Marvel in '75, which was really very enjoyable. Got to meet everyone that worked up there, all very nice people.
I'm jealous. That's like the prime time, 75 to 80. It's like, oh, pre Jim Shooter. It's like, ooh, I'm not saying anything bad about Jim Shooter. It's just there's something about the 60s and 70s Marvels. It's just kind of like,
I think
iconic.
he was. I think technically he was there at the time, but he I forget who did what and when, but
well, I think the editor-in-chief
yes,
that you're talking about was Marv Wolfman, and then I think I don't remember the order. I think Archie Goodwin did it for a brief time, and then it finally got to be Shooter for a long time. But
I know Marv, Len Wein, Archie Goodwin.
Yeah.
I forget which order, like you said.
Yeah.
It all blurs together. But yes, so.
But you probably got in there the right time, because Marv always seemed, because the first time I saw Marv was on the Dracula title and Crazy Magazine, things like that. So it seemed like he was more open to different people, different ideas, and things like that as an editor. So
in retrospect, Marvel at that time was very open. It almost chaotic, you might say, but they were trying a lot of things. I mean, the titles would come and go so quickly. I mean, that's one of the things that Howard the Duck was a surprise. I mean, this weird little title, no one had any idea what would become of that one. And I think it's one of those things that, I don't know, Stan wasn't quite paying attention, and suddenly there's a book called Howard the Duck, and people are asking him about it. So anyway.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because, you see people kind of laugh about it now, but you see like advertising at the time and any sort of promotion, they always had Howard the Duck pictured in there, even more than Star Wars or something. You'd think that would be the biggest title, but I think for a time, Howard the Duck was the biggest seller for the whole company.
Well, there's a certain amount of comedy relief in there, but well, I think at that point in time that their biggest seller might have been the X-Men. I forget exactly, but X-Men was doing very well.
Yeah, I think that kind of surpassed it. It's like the new X-Men started 75, as did Howard the Duck, but I think it took a while for X-Men to kind of ramp up. By 79, 80, yeah, it was the top.
Yes.
It never dropped. So,
True.
But
yes, I think in 1975, I don't think any title seemed to stand out.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe the old standards.
Yeah, it was the old guard, like Spider-Man, Fantastic Four. Yeah. So we're talking a lot about Marvel. Of course, you worked there for a lot. You did New Mutants and Firestar, Bizarre Adventures, other things. But later you moved on to DC. And how and why did that happen?
It's one of those things where the people in the comics biz all move around. And I tend to, one aspect of working in the comics biz is working with people you like to work with. Which makes sense. I mean, you want to work with people you like working with, and all the people I've been working with suddenly were all working at DC, and I just sort of gravitated over there. I mean, editors like Mike Carlin and Marv Wolfman. I had just drawn an issue of Spider-Man written by Marv Wolfman, and it was a two-parter, and Marv left Marvel mid-story, so had no idea how the story was supposed to end. But then he was suddenly working at DC. I mean, he's one of those people that had been working at both of them,
right,
on and off, you know, all the time. Anyway, so I knew a lot of people. The same people I had been working with at Marvel were now all working at DC. So I just sort of ended up over there, and opportunities came up, and so on. I forget what the first thing I did at DC was.
I don't know, but I thought it was Batman, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Could be. I inked various things. I did ink some Batman stuff early on. A few Alien Armageddon over Dan Jurgens. That was fun. I got to pencil a couple of pages for Batman. Justice League International. I forget. It'll come to me.
Right.
Eventually, I ended up working on Vertigo stuff, which is my personal preference. I mean, I just like the weird fantasy type stuff.
Yeah, I was going to ask why, not that, there's anything wrong with that. I was just kind of curious, because I think overall now you've worked for Vertigo longer than any of the other. I mean, it's still DC.
Yes,
but,
yes. That's right, Vertigo. It's no longer Vertigo. I'm actually still working for them. Well, now they're back to DC. Yes, I mean that was also inadvertent in that. Well, ironically, I was in on my way to a convention in London and had dropped by to visit Brian Talbot, who was drawing several story arcs for Sandman. And the day we were supposed to go to the convention, he still had 2 pages left to do on his Sandman story arc. And the regular inker on that I think he'd just gone on vacation. And that inker was Mark Buckingham, who of course is now drawing Fables, who I've worked with a long time. Anyway, I just happened to be there. I got corralled into inking 2 pages of Sandman. So that was my introduction to the folks over at the Vertigo side of DC. And I started doing a lot more work with them, from both Karen Berger and Shelley Bond. I think at this point it's been since 1995, something like that.
Sounds about right. Yeah.
It's a while.
Yeah.
Now, although I was actually at that point still doing, I mean, as a freelancer, I was still doing stuff with DC. I think one of the last things I did at DC was inking a Steve Ditko job, who is one of my favorite artists. I mean, the reason as a young fan, I was inspired to do this stuff from mostly Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, as many people were. So being able to work with those guys was always a treat. I got to ink a little bit of Jack Kirby and several issues drawn by Steve Ditko over the years.
That's cool.
Anyway, so that was the last thing I did at Marvel was an Avengers. I think it was the last thing I did, an Avengers story that Steve Ditko drew a sequence, and I was the inker on it.
Very cool. Now, back then, were you just kind of jumping back and forth between the companies, or
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of people seem to do that eventually? There's no real loyalty anymore. It was just
Well,
like,
it's not that so much, but an editor will call up and say, "Would you like to ink a Steve Ditko story?" I don't know. I
nah.
don't care who he was penciling it for. I was in.
Yeah.
So I was happy to do that.
Hmm.
Um, I even got to meet him once, briefly up at Marvel, and he told me he liked what I was doing. So I took that as a definite sign that I was on the right track. So that was nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Everybody always kind of thought he was kind of a recluse and everything, but he actually was not outgoing that he was going to conventions, but I mean more outgoing if you got to meet him and talk to him and
Yeah,
everything. He wasn't, like that or anything like that. You
he wasn't so much a recluse as he just wasn't interested in uh, I don't know, the public side of comics, you might say.
Yeah.
Like you say, he never went to conventions. He wasn't interested in that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I'm friends with Mort Todd, who published Crack for a while, and he
uh,
also worked for Marvel. So,
yes, yes.
and he was close with Steve. And I asked him, when I was working on my Crack book years ago, it was like, what was Steve Ditko like? I had no idea. And he says, oh, yeah, he would just talk to you about everything. And I said, would he even talk about Spider-Man? Oh, yeah, he would tell you everything. It just, he didn't do it in public. Like, he would never do
I
a podcast like this to talk about his
No,
career. We'd have no interest.
no.
So, but yeah, privately, yeah, if you're sitting with him, yeah, he'd tell you what he felt,
Yeah,
what he
yeah.
did. So,
Wow, I loved his work. I mean, it's a major influence on my approach to comics. I mean, he's uh, I don't know. I think he's one of the best storytellers in business. Just a fabulous sense of space and pacing and dynamics. Plus, he managed to do it all in a really simple way. I mean, his work wasn't dependent on heavy rendering or whatever. Not
right.
that there's anything wrong with that. I mean,
No, but
there's many ways to do it, but I particularly love the way he did it.
yeah, it's like when you look at his early pages, it's very simple, but
But very effective.
deceptively simple. I'll say that, because it's not really
Yes.
simple. It's just, it's not embellished with a lot of heavy,
No, no. Beautifully drawn, terrific choreography. Just, anyway, a
So,
particular favorite.
so growing up, I'll go into that direction since obviously you just said you're a Ditko
Sure.
fan. What did you read in comic books growing up?
Well, I mean, as a little kid, I just read whatever happened to be available. I think the earliest ones that I remember were Harvey Comics and stuff like
Yay.
that. We're talking, the late 50s.
Mhm.
Somewhere along the way, I started reading, the not funny animal stuff. And I remember the early random DC comics, nothing in particular, but as I got older, I did gravitate towards the, Superman comes to mind.
Mhm.
I like Superman imaginary stories. Wayne
Mhm.
Boring,
Mhm.
the way he drew Superman as if he were just walking through the air. Just um, as I got older, Marvel became a thing. I remember somehow I did read the first Spider-Man story.
Hmm.
And anyway, eventually in the early 60s, I became an actual fan of this. Rather than just reading casually, I thought, oh, I have to get every single issue now. And it was Jack Kirby on Thor that caught my attention.
Okay.
I mean, I eventually figured out that there were specific artists drawing these things, and I say, oh, all of the stories I like are drawn by Jack Kirby.
Hmm.
And actually, before that, the first time I was aware of comics being drawn by actual people were Gil Kane and Carmine Infantino doing the science fiction-y stuff at DC.
Hmm.
And then eventually I got to the Kirby and Ditko stuff and so on.
Mhm.
Kubert, another longtime favorite.
Mm-hmm.
I'm tempted to say the usual suspects. Somewhere along the way, Neil Adams and Jim Steranko showed up.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of injected fresh ideas into the comics biz.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in hindsight, we know that very few people were hired in those years. So any new person that came along was conspicuous.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually things changed completely. And
Mm.
I think in the early 70s, it was late 60s, I forget the exact time, but all the new young guys like Kaluta, Wrightson, Shaken, Simons, and they all seem to show up around the same time.
Yeah, that's like 71, 72, somewhere around there, I guess.
Something like that.
Maybe a little bit earlier, but when they got their,
Yeah.
notoriety, I'll say. They might have started a couple years before, but sometimes it takes a while to go, oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as an avid young fan, I saw all of their stuff. I mean, I first saw Bernie Wrightson stuff on the fan page in Creepy magazine. He did something for them, and sometime in the mid 60s. It was funny because I was talking with Bernie, and he remembered something that I had done that ended up on the fan pages of Creepy. So we're both checking those things out. So, anyway, so
you talked about inking Ditko. Did you ever ink Kirby or anybody else that you admired like that?
A little bit. I inked a Devil Dinosaur cover and a Machine Man cover, but the Machine Man cover I did was really weird, so they never published it.
No.
Except in an issue of Foom. And I inked a couple of convention drawings. Trying to think of the things I inked in real time, as they say, when Jack actually drew it and then I inked it. And I inked a couple of panels on Destroyer Duck, so just helping out. I mean,
right.
There's no credit, but
Alfredo
Alcala was the inker on that one. And it just so happened that I lived upstairs from Tom Orzechowski, who was lettering the thing. So I got to see it as it was in progress. And I asked Alfredo if he'd mind if I inked some of it. And since it was a benefit book for Steve Gerber and nobody was getting paid, he was fine with not inking stuff. So I just inked a couple things that you wouldn't notice that it wasn't Alfredo. So anyway.
Well, one of the things
yes.
One of the things I wanted to ask about, and we did talk a little bit briefly. So it seemed like we said that Vertigo was probably the company you worked at the longest. Is Fables the longest running title you've worked on, or is it something else?
As it turns out, it is.
Okay.
It's Fables started in 2002. And it actually is still ongoing today. I'm not sure how much. I know it's been mentioned. It hasn't. I don't know if it's been announced. Well, it's not like it's top secret or anything, but there's a new series, new Fables series that's coming out, and I've been working on inking that. There's several issues in already, but that's what I've been working on. Anyway, so it's been going for almost 20 years now.
Now, did you take a break, or have you been on it the whole time?
There were many inkers on that book, but I was like the regular inker for a lot of it.
Okay, because I know you won four Eisner Awards, so you had to have been on it for a certain amount of time
in the original run, and I inked, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of that, something like that. I was just notified that our connection has gone wonky.
No, it's doing okay. You kind of
okay.
Clip a little bit off, but it was that
All
way
right.
with Trina. It was that way with Trina as well, but I just kept her talking, so it was okay. So
Okay.
I'm more concerned about the audio than the visual. So if you freeze like this, it's okay. So we can continue. So go ahead, Fables.
I forget where I trailed off.
Well, I mentioned that you were like a primary inker probably at least between 2003 and 2007 because you got 4 Eisners right in a row. Were you like the only inker then, or are you just the one that got all the praise?
The way the series was set up was that there was a main storyline, and then there were other stories with different artists. So there were there's many artists involved in Fables, but I was the main inker on the main storyline, which was penciled by, the first issue was penciled by Lan Medina, and then Mark Buckingham was the regular penciler for the main storyline that was going. But then I inked most of what he did, although I took some time off to illustrate a prose Fables novel that Bill Willingham wrote. And then when that finished up, I went back to inking on the book. I think I took like, I don't know, 10 or 15 issues off. Probably not that many. I'd have to actually look. Or something like that. Anyway, but I just did a lot of inking. We also, it's one of those titles that always seem to have deadline problems. So there was often 3 or 4 inkers on any given issue. Andrew Peaboy did a lot of inking, and they called Dan Green every now and again. I think that pretty much it. And sometimes Mark Buckingham did his own inking to save time. These pages are all being mailed around, which takes up time. Of course, during the course of working on Fables, digital stuff got better, so we could send files around. And occasionally, you mentioned working digitally, that I would sometimes get files of the pencils and print them up in the blue line method and ink off that if things got really tight. But always hated working that way and try to avoid it whenever possible. But anyway, I inked a lot of Fables pages over the years.
Now, did you take a break from it because you had other work to do, or you just took a break?
Yeah, I took a break to work on illustrating the Fables novel.
Oh, okay.
So that's what that was. I took a break from Fables to work on Fables. So
now you also did a lot of
slightly different Fables project. So
right. Did you also did a bunch of work for Paradox Press, which again is DC?
Yes.
But was that
fun.
at the same time, or is that before?
Or that was earlier.
Okay.
Some of the same editors.
Okay. Because a lot of times I see all this stuff after the fact, and I don't check the dates, so I just figure, oh, it's just stuff he's doing.
Alternate projects. No, those were fun to do because they were usually like 2 or 3 pages, just short little things. They were always in a 9-panel format. it was interesting. Again, those were fun because being just little short things, you could, well, I could switch up styles. They didn't all have to be in the same style. I remember I particularly enjoyed doing, there was a story about Blackbeard. Bluebeard was in Fables, Blackbeard was in the Paradox Press. And something about sailors being shanghaied in old San Francisco. That was fun. I could actually research the actual places that some of them still exist. So all these years later. Anyway, so I did a fair number of things for the Big Little books or whatever they were called.
Yeah, they were trade paperbacks, right? Yeah, they weren't really comic books. So, and I forgot the series title, but yeah, there's a bunch of them for a while there. The something book of something.
Exactly.
And I used to flip through those a lot and buy those. Those were kind of neat.
Yes.
Now, it says on your bio, but I didn't see what comics you worked on, that you worked briefly for Disney. Was that for Marvel, or
yes,
or that was directly through Disney, or what?
In the days when they were two separate companies. I had worked, one of the things I had done at DC was some stuff on Swamp Thing. And Heidi McDonald was the editor at that time. And then she ended up working for Disney Comics, as did Marv Wolfman. And anyway, I did a few things for Disney. I inked the first cover of the Roger Rabbit comic book.
Okay.
Over Rick Hoberg was the penciler, and I did the inking. And I did a gargoyle story for Disney Digest. That was fun, based on the cartoon show, and a few other things. Not a whole lot of work. The thing about Disney was that they did not return the artwork, and which was, a major negative. But it was fun just to do a couple of things for Disney.
Right.
Which is ironic now that Disney owns Marvel.
Right.
And they no longer do the owning it all. Well,
but this was Disney Comics when Disney published them themselves, right? It wasn't Gladstone or Gemstone or Dell or anything else. It was actually when Disney did it. So yeah, okay.
Well, the higher ups at Disney, they don't seem to like actually publishing anything themselves, or didn't at the time. I haven't been following it. I'm curious does Disney actually publish anything themselves?
Not now. I mean, that was when you were working there. Now it's usually farmed out to IDW, and I think maybe Boom.
Well, that's what I mean.
I don't think Marvel does any Disney stuff anymore. So
no.
Yeah. So
it's gotten very odd.
Yeah. So
who knows?
It's basically whoever wants to pay for a license. There was like there was a publisher called Joe Books out of Canada that was publishing things for a while, but I think they're out of business now. So it's just stuff like that.
I think that's why, I love the European Disney stuff. All those fabulous Italian artists who are just, doing very inspiring stuff. For example, they seem to have been keeping those comics alive for whatever that's worth.
Since you stepped out of the frame before we started to get some art pieces, I figure, give you a chance to show them off and say a little bit about them.
Going to conventions, it's always nice to have some what I think of as lower priced things to offer people. So I just printed up recolored an old Spider-Woman cover that I did.
And how was that one you also penciled or just inked?
Yes, I drew this and penciled it. Um, uh, this was originally Spider-Woman number 35
Hmm.
in 1981.
Very
So
cool.
that was a while ago.
Yes.
And then just for fun, I did a facsimile print of Howard, the first page of Howard the Duck #1. I
Oh,
got
okay.
a good scan of the original artwork since it got sold off a long time ago, and then recreated Frank Brunner's original coloring scheme and just smoothed it over a little bit for modern sensibilities and corrected a couple of mistakes that had crept in. There's always things that were colored incorrectly. I mean, in the pre-digital days, I mean, these were done at such a breakneck speed that often the color separators either missed things or didn't bother. I mean, excuse me. Anyway, so I offer these things for people to get at conventions or whatever.
In lieu of a commission or something like that, I'm sure.
There's rarely enough time to do all the commissions. So.
Right. Are what am I asking? Over the years, have you just done penciling and inking, or did you ever do coloring or lettering or anything like that as well? On
a little bit. Often, well, when I was doing things for Star Reach Comics, Tom Orzechowski lived nearby, so it was extremely handy to, I mean, one of the best letterers in the business. It was nice that he could letter a lot of this stuff that, but I can do my own lettering if pressed to. There's one, I did an Iron Man story for Marvel, of course, where Bill Mooney wrote the script and I did the pencils, inks, and letters and colors. So that was fun. But usually, I mean, these things are done in such a hurry. It's really a great convenience to have a lot of different people working on it.
Right. Now, I'm sure you've seen Hogan's Alley magazine over the years.
Yes.
Yeah. And they always show, so I've always started to ask this when I talk to creators and writers and artists and things like that. Inking, what tools do you usually use?
I usually use a Hunch Crow Quill 102, simple pen, and a brush. Lately, I've been using Raphael brushes, but in the world of brushes, I don't know if they're even available anymore. Like 20 years ago, I bought a ton of them. In hindsight, I should have bought more, but I usually like to ink with a Raphael number 3 or 4 brush. Even finding ink these days is a challenge because everyone's gone digital.
Right.
But I still like doing it by hand.
I hate to say the last time I bought ink, which has been a while, but I bought ink at Michael's Art Supply, and it was up here in Oregon. It was about 5 years ago, and they had to search for it, and they found it, and the bottles were all dusty. Nobody's buying them anymore. And that was the last one I ever bought. And I don't do much artwork myself very much these days. I'm more into writing, so it's like, it's just what I have, so may even dry up in the bottle, but anyway. And I assume because you motioned with your right hand that you're right-handed.
I am.
Okay, because they always do that in Hogan's Alley too, which I always think is kind of neat. They show somebody holding the pen, or the brush, and how their grip, and if they're right-handed or left-handed. So, I figured, yeah, that's kind of interesting because nobody ever thinks to ask that. Just the art is produced. And it's like, so, you know.
It
And
is interesting.
how long does it take you to do a typical page?
Inking or
Penciling or
well,
ink, penciling or inking, you know.
it depends on the pencils. Currently, I'm working with Mark Buckingham.
Mhm.
He's doing a very, very intense job, so it takes a while. I usually give it a couple of days for a page. Fortunately, it pays well enough that I can do it that way. I don't have to just kill myself over the deadlines. Although
Right.
the editors would like to speed it up, but still.
Of course.
Uh, but you know, the way I think of it, there's only so many lines you can squeeze onto a page. So,
Mhm.
so either a day or two, generally speaking. If I'm penciling it, usually the prep end of it takes way more time than actually producing the page.
Mhm.
Figuring out what you want to draw and then figuring out how to draw it and then actually drawing it
Mhm.
and so on.
Mhm. You know, we're kind of wrapping up, but I have to ask
Okay.
you about this. You have participated in a group, and I have the actual book it's based on, Seduction of the Innocent.
Yes.
That's the real deal book there. Um,
That was fun.
do you still ever participate in that? I know there's no, because of COVID and everything, there's no real conventions much, but over the years, I mean, do you still play in the band with Billy Mooney and all the others?
Well, we haven't. Well, the last time we actually played was quite some time ago.
Mhm.
I think 1999.
Really? I thought it was,
Yes.
wow, that's far
Um,
back.
well, it's just one of those things where meeting various people at the San Diego convention and
Mhm.
talking about playing, and we all thought, well, let's give it a try and see what happens. And it
Mhm.
was, I mean, the main instigator of that group was Bill Mooney
Yeah.
and Miguel Ferrer, and it was also Max Allen Collins
Mhm.
and myself on bass and John Christensen
Mhm.
on guitar. Um, it was a comics themed band. All of us were working in comics in one way or another.
Mhm.
Bill and Miguel had been writing a lot of comics. They did a series at Marvel, Comet Man,
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah.
and various things. And I worked on several projects with them as well. And Max Allen Collins, of course, was writing the Dick Tracy comic strip at that time,
Mhm.
and eventually Ms. Tree and all kinds of other stuff. And who else? And even Chris Christensen has been working on some music projects with Will Eisner. So anyway, so it was a comics themed band that we played at, and we played at comics conventions. We played
Mhm.
at the Heroes Con in Charlotte, Baycon, San Francisco, San Diego Con. Um, we put out a couple of CDs. So
If you hear that noise, that's my dog. I'm sorry.
I was thinking I hear the snorting of
Yeah.
a happy dog there.
So I'm sorry. I try to keep a straight face, and then I was like, "Arr, arr." Anyway,
A little
how
a
did they
little
choose? How did you?
commentary.
I've never asked with Seduction of the Innocent. How did they choose you? I mean, you were probably already friends, but did they know you played the bass, or how'd that work?
Well, it was just one of those moments where there was a party at the San Diego Con,
Mm.
and a bunch of wise guys sitting at the back of the room listening to the band that was playing. Everyone saying, they're not very good. I can play better than that. And there's your dog behind you.
There's
A
Lulu.
fine-looking fellow.
That's a female, Lulu.
Ah,
And this is, I got Mia too. So anyway, there's Mia. Yay, the pet's parade. Okay,
oh,
go ahead. Sorry.
anyway, it's one of those things where at that point in time, I think Miguel had just started doing acting, but he had been a professional jazz drummer for quite some time. Really good drummer. And Bill plays guitar. Max Collins played keyboards, and I piped up that I played bass.
Oh, okay.
And we tried it out, and it seemed to work. And we ended up playing at the San Diego Con. Everyone seemed to have a good time, and we did it for several shows in various places. So that's how that came about. So.
That's very good. Yeah, because I think I saw one of the shows. I couldn't tell you which year because I used to go every in San Diego. I used to go every year in the 90s. So it's like, it was one of those years. And, it was just a thrill just knowing it seemed weird. I knew Bill was in Barnes and Barnes, and so I knew he had musical background, but I didn't know all the rest of you did. So it's like, wow, and it's funny because people who are artists like yourself, it's the arts. So a lot of times, people have the ability to play musical instruments as well as draw or whatever, but I don't think of it that way as a fan. I just think that's all you do. You don't do anything else.
Well, in my younger days, I thought I'd either like to play music or do something with artwork, and I really couldn't decide at the time. And the artwork came along first, so I sort of gravitated in that direction. But I've always liked playing. So
did you have any formal training on that, or you just picked it up yourself?
No, untrained. I don't read music. I just try my best to keep the beat.
That's cool.
But I managed to do okay. So
sounds good.
It's fun. It's all fun, or it should be.
Yes.
If it's not fun, then
right. And that's what I always thought about Seduction of the Innocent. I mean, it wasn't so serious that you were just having fun on stage, but you had the ability to play, and it was fun watching it too. So
well, for those guys, it was a fun type band. It wasn't their serious one.
Right.
I mean, all the other people in the band were all actually professional musicians. I was the only one who wasn't. So
but you fooled me. No, you were able to pull it off. So
volume and attitude, that's what we always used to say.
Well, I don't really have any more questions, and I usually try to keep it, between 60 and 90 minutes. But before we wrap it up here, or how we wrap it up here typically on the show is tell me, what projects you're currently working on, and if there's any convention appearances. I know it's difficult during the COVID time, but some people are kind of getting out and about, and how they can contact you.
Convention wise, sort of playing it by ear. I actually have one. I don't know when people are going to be seeing this. Is it live?
A couple weeks. So.
Okay. So the one I'm actually doing tomorrow will be long gone by that point in time.
Okay.
But there's a few scheduled, health concerns permitting. I think I'll be doing the San Diego Con this year, and the San Diego Comics Fest. Both of those are in San Diego. And talking about a few conventions back east that haven't quite been firmed up. So nothing that I can pinpoint specifically at the moment. And I'm working on a few projects, nothing that will be out anytime soon. Fables is still in the works. It's an ongoing thing. I think DC is going to be doing a push for that fairly soon.
Yeah.
But I'm keeping busy. I must say, in these weird times, it's nice to have a job where, I mean, I've always worked at home.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Right.
The idea of not going out is really nothing unusual.
Oh, what's all the fuss? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. We miss going out to restaurants all the time, but aside
Yeah.
from that, it's from our point of view, it's almost business as usual. So, but I do hope to see people at various conventions here or there, so wherever those might be.
And then if people want to get in contact you, do you have a website or anything else?
I don't really have a website. I do have a Facebook page that I log on to every now and again. So, but mostly I just keep working. So, I've got some noisy neighbors, but
I'm not hearing. All right. Well, it's always a pleasure. Go ahead.
Yes, it's been nice chatting with you. I hope people aren't bored to tears, but
well, I always like to do these shows. Well, I do shows about music. I do shows about TV and movies and
yes.
comic books and animation, stuff like that. And you may know my friend Lee Hester. He was the one who says, you got to get Trina on the show. And I said, if I get Trina on the show, I got to get Steve on the show. So
yes.
I always enjoy talking to you and seeing you when I can. It's been a while, but
Yes, I did a store signing at his store with Gene Colan, and that was one of my personal highlights. Speaking of Lee, Gene Colan was a particularly nice man. Well, yes. I've been lucky. Most of the people I work with in comics are nice people. So
yeah,
it's generally a fun group. There's a few weird,
as in any profession. So. All right. Well, that about wraps it up. And I want to thank you, Steve Leialoha, for being my special guest. And
my pleasure. Thank you.
And we had all the animals here, the dogs and kitties, and
my cat's just passed out,
falling asleep, as everybody at home is doing right now. All right, and we'll see you next time on the Fun Ideas podcast.